Over Christmas and New Year 2013, we did a cruise on board the Seabourn Legend, visiting various ports in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and an island belonging to India. The cruise started and finished in Singapore, where we also spent 2 days prior to the cruise. It was exactly 10 years since our previous visit to Singapore. We spent most of the time touring the Marina Bay area, which hadn't existed 10 years previously. This very striking hotel is the Marina Bay Sands. At one end of the platform that runs across the top of the hotel is an observation deck, which we went up to admire views right across Singapore. We were staying in a very nice hotel in Orchard Road, one of the main shopping areas. Taxis are pretty cheap in Singapore, but the roads get incredibly congested, so apart from when we were travelling with all our luggage, we used the underground trains to get around. We were in Singapore over a weekend, and it was extremely busy. Malaysians apparently come to Singapore in vast numbers to do their shopping. On a large site behind the Marina Bay Sands Hotel are the gardens by the bay. The gardens include 2 huge glass houses and a number of very tall structures called super trees. It looks to me like a scene from a science fiction film. The super trees are gradually being covered by climbing plants. There's an elevated walkway suspended between them. This was the first of the 2 glass houses we visited. It's called the Flower Dome. There was quite a Christmassy feel, with lots of red-coloured plants. These 2 young women amused me, dressed up for Christmas, but seemingly totally uninterested in their surroundings. The other glass house, called the Cloud Forest, contains a 35-metre high mountain and what they claim is the world's highest indoor waterfall. Attached to the Marina Bay Sands Hotel is a vast shopping mall, with Venetian-style canals and gondolas. We celebrated my 60th birthday in Singapore. Margaret had provided various decorations for our hotel room, and this dessert was part of an excellent dinner we enjoyed. The first stop on our cruise was the Malaysian island of Penang. We hired a taxi for a few hours to take a tour of the island. The Penang Hill Funicular Railway was built 100 years ago, although the trains have been modernised quite recently. You get a good view from the top, but it was very murky the day we were there. There are, of course, temples everywhere in Asia. This Hindu temple was at the top of Penang Hill. After Penang Hill, we visited the much more impressive Kek Lok Si Buddhist temple. This unusual inclined lift takes you between 2 parts of what is the largest Buddhist temple in Southeast Asia. Our driver spoke little English, but was keen to take us to various extra places where there would no doubt have been shopping opportunities. It was a bit of a struggle, but we managed to keep him on track with what we wanted to see. Next, we went up to the north coast, where the tourist beaches are. Penang isn't a major destination for Western tourists. They were mainly Malaysian tourists. We were in Penang on Christmas Day, and despite Malaysia being a predominantly Muslim country, there was a celebration taking place back in Georgetown, where our ship was moored. Our overall impressions of Penang were that it's very heavily built up and not particularly scenic. Overnight, we cruised about 100 miles northwest, arriving on Boxing Day at another Malaysian island, Langkawi. Once again, we hired a taxi and driver for a few hours to take us around the main sites. The main attraction was the Langkawi cable car. It's very popular, and we had to queue for an hour to get on it. The views are spectacular, helped by the fact that Langkawi is a much more unspoilt environment than Penang. The cable car is claimed to be the steepest in the world. They had also built this curved suspension bridge between two of the mountains, but unfortunately it was closed. As well as the cable car trip, we did a circuit of most of the island and had a stroll along one of the beaches, and then back to the ship. 200 miles further up the coast, we arrived at the Thai island of Phuket, where, for a change, we took an organised group tour. The Charlong Buddhist temple site has several very ornate buildings with lots of gold decorations. Although the architecture is very characteristic of Thailand, this area was settled by a lot of Chinese traders, and it's their influence and superstitions that led to the use of firecrackers to ward off evil spirits. Although I'm very keen on cashew nuts, I'd never seen them growing. We visited a shop full of cashew products with a demonstration of them being shelled manually. The nuts grow individually on the end of large fruits. The highlight of this day's excursion on Phuket was a ride on an elephant. The elephants seemed to have an insatiable appetite for bananas. They also put on a bit of a show, doing various tricks. We both declined the option to take part in this very risky-looking massage. Our next destination was the remote Andaman and Nicobar Islands, at the eastern edge of the Bay of Bengal. The islands belong to India. We docked in Port Blair. The port was used by very run-down old local ships, and quite unused to tourists. In colonial days, the British used Port Blair as a penal colony, and housed large numbers of Indians who fought for their independence. Our guide told us of the appallingly harsh treatment of the prisoners by the British. The prisoners would of course have been regarded by the British as terrorists, but for the Indians they were freedom fighters. The museums and aquarium we visited after the jail even offered free admission to freedom fighters. We had taken an organised tour because there was no other way to get from the ship to the town. We had some free time to wander around the town centre. Despite being so far from mainland India, Port Blair was unmistakably Indian, even if the roads were fairly quiet and orderly. The surest sign was cows roaming the streets and eating rubbish. At the northern tip of the Indonesian island of Sumatra lies the tiny island Pulau Wei. They rarely see cruise ships, and we were given a splendid reception. Lots of locals turned out to see our ship, including whole families on a motorcycle. They were all very friendly, and many were keen to have their photos taken with us. We hired a young woman with a motorcycle taxi to take us around. The only smart building was the mosque, but the scenery was lovely. Pulau Wei was definitely a highlight of the trip, mainly because of the friendliness of all the local people. Further down the coast of Sumatra was the big industrial port of Belawan. There being nothing to see in Belawan, we took a tour to Medan, the largest city on Sumatra. The tour started with a look around a mansion built by a prominent Chinese immigrant. We then had a stroll through a local market. A look at the post office built by the Dutch in colonial times, and an 18th century Sultan's palace. The most interesting stop on the tour was this building, which, rather surprisingly, is a Roman Catholic church. It seems to have influences from many cultures and religions. and includes some modern touches, such as the football gear and baseball cap on the children with Jesus. From Belawan we crossed back over to Malaysia and the island of Pulau Pangkor. It's a very small island covered in rainforest, with fishing villages all along the east coast. We hired one of these pink taxis to take us around. This rather grand Chinese temple illustrates a point made almost everywhere we visited on this cruise, that most of the wealth belongs to the Chinese communities rather than the indigenous people. We passed by this very traditional boatyard on our way round to the west coast where the beaches are, but the weather was not kind. And after a quick look at another, more modest temple, we returned to the ship. Our final port of call before returning to Singapore was Port Klang, gateway to the Malaysian capital Kuala Lumpur. KL, as it's known, is a very modern city, trying to be like Singapore, but somehow not quite making it. We used a very efficient monorail and underground train system to get around, first visiting Chinatown, which specialised in selling copycat branded goods, and then a couple of temples, the impressive public buildings surrounding Independence Square, and St Mary's Cathedral. We went up to the observation deck in the telecom tower to get great views in all directions, although the view of the iconic Petronas Towers is not so good because you don't really see it as twin towers from this direction. And then it was back to Singapore and a flight home. Most of the places we visited on this cruise were interesting without being particularly special, but the cruise itself was brilliant, with excellent staff and service and lovely fellow passengers.